So here we are. I'm going to end this space here. Let's do it. All right. So we now have the opportunity to talk about William James. And he and Charles Sanders Peirce established a philosophical school of thought called called Pragmatism. It's an American school of thought called Pragmatism. We're not going to go too much into a digression onto that. However, we are going to talk about it a little bit. It's a very interesting philosophical approach. So, the pragmatic maxim, I'm going to read a quote here. Consider what effects, E-F-F-E-C-T-S, what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the object of our conception to have. So you've got an idea, a conception. The object of your conception is the thing that you're thinking about, that the concept is pointing towards. So a blue ball in my yard. The concept of the blue ball. I think about what practical effects or what effects that might have practical bearings are tied to that concept. Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object, which is to say that there's nothing more to the idea than whatever it is that can have practical effect. Welcome, Twilight. So this is the pragmatic maxim. It's the school of thought that the two best American philosophers, sometimes people call Peirce the greatest American philosopher, but I think it's pretty clearly William James. But in any case, the two of them helped to found this pragmatic school. So that's pragmatism. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, one way of thinking about it is like this. Somebody might say philosophers care about truth, but pragmatic people just care about what works. That's not what the pragmatists are doing. What the pragmatists are doing is they're saying, no. What works is the definition of truth. Okay, so they conceive themselves as caring about the truth, but it would go something like this. If the idea you have is a map of the world around you, and you use that map, you use those ideas to navigate the world, and you fall off a cliff rather than getting to your destination, then there's something wrong with your map. There's something false about your map. There's something untrue about it because it didn't practically work. However, the degree to which one map practically works in the world over another is the degree to which it's closer to the truth. Okay, so they're defining truth as ideas that practically work. All right, we're not going to go too far into that, like we said, but that's a really cool idea, and it's going to be clear how that's being used in this essay because that's his approach, and it's going to emerge. All right, let's move this over here and say, so the first section is rationality and the free will controversy. Here's a summation. We must always maintain doubt. If we had a demonstration, so this is one of the first interesting things about William James's argument for free will, is that he says, wait a minute, if I can prove to you for sure that you're free, if I have a deductive argument that if you understand the argument, you're just forced to the conclusion, then you're not as free as you were before you heard that argument, because now you're forced to believe in free will. And because I believe in freedom, says William James, I'm going to eschew all such arguments. I don't want to find an argument I'm not interested in an argument that would force you to believe in determinism or force you to believe in free will. If there was one that forced you to believe in determinism, he would obviously respect it and probably become a determinist. But we'll see in a moment that he doesn't think any such arguments exist. But before he says that he doesn't think any such arguments exist for either side, and before he proves it or makes an argument trying to prove that that's the case, he first says, I'm not interested in that. I wouldn't want there to be a knockdown argument that proves free will because I want to live in a world with freedom. Now, he's admitting his bias, right? So his pragmatism allows him to talk about psychological motivations and to be candid. He argues that we should be candid about what it is that to the best of our understanding, is motivating us to want to believe one thing or another. However, that's not his pragmatism, right? That's not his philosophy. He's not saying, well, figure out what you want to believe and then that's good enough for you. It's not a relativism. He's talking about it because he's a pragmatist and so it's relevant, but he makes philosophical arguments that are not relativistic. Okay, but because he's a pragmatist, because he thinks that there's psychological revelations. We were talking, Path has brought up a couple times, where's Nietzsche in all of this? Well, Paul Ray was in a love triangle with Nietzsche, and William James clearly is a child of Nietzsche. There's no doubt. Now, he disagrees with Nietzsche on a great many things. I mean, the entire point of his essay here is to argue that we are not living in a singular universe where every tiny detail is tied to every other one in a deterministic, necessary sort of a way. And yet Nietzsche was a fatalist. Nietzsche did believe that. It doesn't mean he was a determinist, and Nietzsche certainly was critical of science, but he did have a fatalist view of the cosmos. William James is directly antithetical to that. So I'm not saying he's copying Nietzsche or he believes things because Nietzsche says them. Rather, what I'm saying is that Nietzsche's criticisms of science, rather of scientism, and Nietzsche's understanding. Nietzsche said, I've been a psychologist through and through. He says, I judge the philosophy by the philosopher. He doesn't say it in this. This is a good formula for understanding what that means. Judging the philosophy by the philosopher and judging the philosopher by the philosophy. And so Nietzsche had tons of insights that were characterological, where he says, I'll get to the bottom of this. That argument's not nearly as good as you're pretending it is. Why? Because now I know something about you. I know what's motivating you in this direction. And William James is clearly starting there. That's his starting point, where he says, okay, well, let's figure out what's true about me, why I want to believe this or why you want to believe that. Now, that sounds very relativistic, and we're going to see when we look at this essay that the essay is not relativistic. So again, I want to underline, just because it's appreciable or appropriate to discuss all of those things, you're only a relativist if you think that's all that needs to be discussed. However, you're a Nietzschean or you're a William Jamesian if you say, well, wait a minute, let's do philosophy, let's make some arguments, let's look at the consequences of these ideas and try to figure out what's true. And at the same time, we can keep in mind these psychological things, and that might help us navigate the waters, right? Because those are real forces that involved. And so we'll have a better picture of the whole. Okay. So if we have a demonstration of free will, then we would be forced to believe in it, and therefore we wouldn't be as free. So he says, I don't want such an argument. We cannot accept the idea of free will unless we are capable of rejecting it. Now, that's an interesting psychological insight, and also, I think, a sophisticated philosophical position, right? There's a danger potentially in the determinists and in the hardcore free will libertarian types, where they are looking for a deductive, conclusive knockdown argument, which is something akin to the danger of a tautology. In other words, if you can make your argument that strong and unassailable, and it has to be the case, the next thing you should say to yourself is not, oh my gosh, it has to be the case. What insight? It should rather be, wait a minute, what have we done to reduce the terms so that, of course, they have to be the case, but it's not as interesting as it used to be. Now, that's not a hard rule. I mean, you could have a revelation in any aspect of philosophy where you say, wow, that's amazing. It's revolutionary. It's changed my way of thinking. That's obviously still on the table. But often what happens is people are seeking to make the strongest argument they can. And so they have to sophisticate the terms and give up this and say, I'm fighting over here. And then by the time they've limited themselves so much so that they have an unshakable argument for the thing, they've actually given up all of the ground that made people want to argue against them in the first place. And then they just go about forgetting that they gave up that ground or smuggling in some of that ground, at least in the minds of their readers. Again, it's not a hard rule, but it's something that William James is conscious of and doesn't want to fall into that trap philosophically. So I would say this is our first thinker that we're reading so far, and I'm not saying this because he's arguing for free will. I have my disagreements with him, but I would say William James is clearly on a sophistication level of thinking that is a bit higher than the first two that we've looked at, and higher than the other libertarians some of the other libertarians that we're going to be looking at. Okay. Now he says this: I have two suppositions which underpin what I'm about to argue. One, when we make theories about the world, we discuss them with one another, and we do so in order to attain a conception of things which shall give us subjective satisfaction. So again, he's bringing in the psychological. He's saying the whole reason for this argument is that, look, we're aiming for truth, but the truth isn't something solid outside ourselves that's in our house like a trophy that we now own. The truth is the degree to which I care about the truth that I've accomplished is that I'm satisfied psychologically. There's a subjective satisfaction. So there's a part of me that says, yes, I'm okay agreeing with that after I've looked at all the things that might make me say it's wrong and all of the things that knocked away my other argument that I thought was right. And so I changed it or revised it or something. So he's bringing up subjective. And it's important to remember that he's not a relativist. However, the subjective is something he won't ignore for even a second while he's also doing his philosophical arguments. Okay, the second one is, if there be two conceptions, two options of what I could think is true about the world, and the one seems to me on the whole more reasonable, he says more rational, but I think from the context you can say more reasonable to believe in is sort of what he's getting at, than the other one is, then I'm entitled to suppose that the more reasonable to believe in one is the truer of the two. Okay, so he's saying, look, we're going to do some philosophical examination of ideas. Here's how I'm going to do it. I'm looking for something that will satisfy me subjectively that I've gotten to the truth. So I'm half of the equation here, right? I have to relate to the truth, but the truth has to be something that will satisfy me, right? And so under that, he then says, okay, if I have to choose between two ideas, if I think that if I examine what it would require me to believe and what it would do to me to accept one of them versus the other, and I say it's more reasonable this one rather than that one, I have every right in the world to accept that one as closer to the truth. And that might be the best we can do. It might not be, whatever. But he says, I at least have that. I can at least do that. Okay, fine. There's little to disagree with, or there's a lot to disagree with, depending on if someone really doesn't like this approach. But for now, let's just say, let's get into what his argument is here. Our only way to understand the world better is to try. Thought and investigation conceptualized as action. So another thing that we'll add in here from his pragmatism approach is it's something like this. I'm a freshman in college. Maybe I'm very clever. Maybe you think about a freshman with a high IQ and he's always done well academically, and he's really interested in the sharp, cool arguments he's going to learn, and he's sort of grabbing at them and adopting them and imagining believing them or arguing for them with his friends where they're in their dorm room and they're sharpening their teeth like little baby wolves on how to make arguments and defend them and all of that fun stuff that you do. It's like, okay, that's one approach to ideas. We might call it sophomoric or something if we wanted to. There's a lot of connotations there. But in any case, there's another way of thinking about ideas and the truth, which is something like this. This is more a pragmatic approach, a William Jamesian approach, which is something like, okay, if I actually believe the idea, then my body and my mind and my inclinations and how I navigate the world are all altered by my acceptance of that idea. I accept the idea to the degree to which I have incorporated it, right? Put it into my body in some way. It's been incorporated into me. And what that means is, now Nietzsche had this great quote, something about the thinking man. Oh, shoot. Let me look up this quote. I quote him all the time, but I don't know this quote well enough. Nietzsche. Sorry, I just looked at this quote the other day. Oh I'm not going to be able to find it quickly enough. Okay, the gist of the idea is something like this notion of this William Jamesian notion, which is accepting the idea and putting it into your body makes you live a certain way. And then you look at the effects of how well you're succeeding or failing, and you can use that to judge whether or not you need to update your map, whether or not your ideas aren't really that good, or at least aren't good enough to get you to where you're aiming or something like that. Okay. So it's thought and investigation conceptualized as action. It's embodied. You're kind of putting your chips on the table with these ideas. It's not just, ooh, I have a clever argument for determinism and I can use it to look smart and win arguments. Ooh, I've got a clever argument for free will and I can use it to look smart and win arguments. It's like, no, wait a minute, pause. That's fine. That's a peripheral game and we're not saying anything bad about it. But this William Jamesian approach, this pragmatic approach, and also Nietzsche had this idea that he said, I write in blood that I may be read in blood. And it's this idea that the idea should change who you are. And then you can use how well that's working to say, well, maybe it's not yet a sufficient conception of the truth. So we've really got a lot of this idea of how this pragmatism is working already. Okay. He says this, quote, I, for one, feel as free to try conceptions of moral as of mechanical or of logical rationality. Okay, so it's pretty simple what that means, right? He says, okay, well, I'm going to do that with ideas. And I'm going to say, look, scientifically, we do this all the time. There's actually a radical empiricism to all of this, right? He's defining truth. He's not saying what works is better than what's true. He's saying what works is what's true. By definition, if it's not working, then it's not accurately reflecting the cosmos. It's not in line with what's real. And so it's less true. He says, well, that's fine. We do that in physics all the time. That's science. Is I believe the world works like this. Well, if the world did work like this and I set up this experiment, then A should be the result instead of B. Let's run the experiment. Oh, B is the result. Well, then I'm getting rid of that idea because that idea doesn't map onto reality accurately enough. And he's saying, okay, right, fair enough. But what if we thought of all truth that way? What if we said, even to the subjective, let's have an analogous definition of truth for things that are what it's like to be in the world rather than just what's external to ourselves, and say, okay, I'm going to incorporate and embody this idea. It's going to alter the way I approach things, and it's going to change the direction I want to go, and it's going to change how I think of myself as being able to get there. And if I fail, then my map, my ideas of the world are just not good enough. There's something not true enough about them. And he says, well, what we could do is we could take any idea about the world and we could say, well, if the ideas about the physical world outrage experiment and go against our observed data collection and our testing of the idea, then we discard the idea. Well, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take metaphysical ideas and I'm going to take subjective, personal, again, subjective doesn't mean relativistic. I'm going to take notions that have something to do with how I conceptualize myself and what it's like to be in the world. And I'm going to put them in front of the experiments of morality. I'm going to say, well, the consequences of this would lead me to have to accept this. And I think that's repugnant. So I'm going to reject it. And I'm going to go this other direction instead. And so he's asserting that he feels justified in doing that philosophically. We may disagree or agree later, but at least we're understanding where he's coming from. And here's a quote. If a certain formula for expressing the nature of the world violates my moral demand, I shall feel free to throw it overboard, or at least to doubt it, as if it disappointed my demand for uniformity of sequence, for example. The one demand being, as far as I can see, quite as subjective and emotional as the other. Now, that's the end of that quote is magic. This is the last thing we'll probably have to talk about with this whole pragmatic approach. One of the things that puts William James on this highly sophisticated playing field, in my view, more so than other libertarians we're going to read, more so than Paul and Henry, the determinists that we've read, is exactly this parenthetical on the end of that quote. Quite as subjective and emotional as the other. In other words, again, this is how he's a child of Nietzsche. Nietzsche's criticism of scientism is really powerful. He's saying the objectivist scientific fiction doesn't get to call my subjectivist narrative or metaphysical fiction fictional, and because it calls it fictional, get to look down on it. That's also on an equal playing field. We're both on equal playing fields. Okay, there are not little bits of hard stuff bouncing around with quantums of energy, obeying laws that they have to follow. That's a very useful language for making predictions about what happens in the physical world. But we know for sure that that's not really what it is. We've already known that for a long time. So it's an extremely useful fiction. I don't want to throw it away. I don't want to believe anything empirical that outrages scientific discovery. Right? The scientists are the final arbiters of all questions that are empirically amenable, that can be adjudicated in that way. That's fine. So we're not being anti-scientific. We're not throwing science in the garbage. But for philosophical satisfaction, I already know that to do all of that is to rely on a fiction. That's okay. They're all on equal playing field. It's not less fictional or more fictional than metaphysical ideas. It's all just attempts to map a world that we can't fully comprehend, and therefore necessarily simplifies certain things. If think about it this way, if you want to, let's say you live in the United States and you want a map of the United States, but you want that map to be perfect. Well, then you want a second United States. You can't have a perfect map unless every tiny detail is on there, in which case it's not a useful map anymore. What makes ideas powerful is that they're approximations and simplifications, right? It doesn't make you say, oh, well, forget science then, because it doesn't have the answer to absolutely everything in every possible way. It's like, no. What makes it powerful is that it's limited itself to certain things, and it can do great work in those things. Likewise, he's not saying we have a total map of the world. What he's saying is, look, I've got a partial conceptualization of what it's like to be in the world, and I have another one that's been suggested to me, and I'm going to have to do some work to judge which one doesn't outrage my moral and physical and rational and principles of regularity and mathematics, right? All of these things are fine to use, but he asserts specifically here, if some idea outrages my moral expectations, and we're going to see how he does that, because he's not just saying, I want the world to be a certain way, and therefore I'll reject all ideas that it's not that way. He's not that relativistic. He's not relativistic at all. So we'll see how he does this in the example through the rest of this essay, and we'll see how much that moral demand is how it's being used, and if it's appropriate or not, we'll judge. But what he says is, if something were to outrage moral demands of mine, I would feel just as free to say, well, fuck that map. I couldn't possibly use a map that makes me think that the world is hell and not worth living in, right? That would be if it outraged my moral demands. I'm not going to use that map. That map's not going to get me anywhere, because it's just going to disgust me with the world or make me nihilistic. And so it's not a very good map, right? If your map is just the text that says, stay home and don't go anywhere, well, that's not a very useful map. Okay. So he says, if it outrages a moral demand, and we'll see what that means in this case, then I'm going to feel just as free to either chuck it overboard or at least to doubt it, as if it violated the idea of, 3 is greater than 2. That's a principle that matters to me that I can't do without. And, so if it violates the uniformity of sequence, for example, I would throw the idea out, and I'm going to throw it out. I assert that I have a right to throw out ideas that violate certain moral demands. Okay, so he's setting the table. The commitments of Paul and Buckley and the like are as much, quote, altars to unknown gods as any commitment to freedom from moral necessity. Boy, just reading that one quote is not enough. That's really that same thing I was just saying a second ago. As far as he can see, quite as subjective and as emotional as the other. So We're going to have to talk about his argument here for why this is the case, or else that's going to feel unjustified, what he just said there. There's a lot I disagree with in this essay by William James. There's lots that I think we can disagree with and that we will in this conversation. However, I think he got this one exactly right. I think this is nail on the head. It's a nuclear bomb. It's a punch in the face, and it's really, really good. So let's rehearse the argument. He says, look, what is determinism? What is indeterminism? He keeps using the word chance, but he just means there's not an unbroken chain of determinism. It seems to me that there's possibilities that are really possible. That's what he's reducing it to, okay? And what he says is, all right, in the deterministic worldview, everything is fated. 1 second after the Big Bang determined what words I'm using in this sentence right now and determined everything for the next 10 billion trillion years. It's all just determined. Okay, that might be true. That's a conception. I'll weigh it on the scales. We're going to deal with it. But it's a claim. He says one way of understanding this claim is to say when we think that A is possible, A or B could happen. When we say that they're both possibilities, and then we live until A does happen, but B doesn't, we then say, oh, A was determined to happen, and B was never really possible. It looked like a possibility because we didn't know all the factors, but once we got to the point where it was settled which one would happen, it's now clear to us A happened instead of B, which means if we're determinists, that A had to happen and B was never really a possibility. The word possibility just means we don't yet have enough information to know which one is impossible and which one is necessary. But for the determinist, anything that you think can happen either has to happen or couldn't possibly happen. There's no middle ground of actual possibility. It's just necessity and impossibility. Or if you believe in indeterminism, if you don't believe in an unbroken chain of causality and all of that, if you don't believe in how Paul Ray says the universal principle of causality that's overarching everything else, then you might think, well, A or B really were possible. We now learned that A is what happened. Then we can examine, why it happened to some degree or whatever, but it's just as possible that B could have happened. B was a real possibility. The determinist, he says, even if they use language differently or try to argue that the word possible should be rightly understood in this limited way, in which case it's still possible, blah, blah, blah. He says, actually examining it honestly, what you're really saying is that B was never possible. It just seemed possible. Now, here's his argument. His argument is, now, wait a minute. Science, hard, deductive, objective examination of the world is always about the data of the real world, what has actually happened. It gives us no information about what didn't happen. So the determinist who believes in science and might be a scientismist, I love using that phrase, I meant it on purpose, a scientismist is a person who's making a radical commitment to the notions that are necessary in order to do science. And instead of saying I ascribe to those notions when I'm doing my science, they say science can't be done without ascribing to it, which we agree with. Therefore, it must be true. It must be true in every other way of inquiring about things. It must be universally true. And William James's point is to say, you didn't find evidence for that in your microscope or your telescope or by weighing anything on a scale. Nothing about the universe told you about what didn't happen. You can't weigh the actuality or impossibility of the possible that never happened. There's nothing in the world. If the world is indeterminate and something just happens, it will look exactly the same in all respects as if the world is determined and necessarily this thing happened. There can be no investigation that would let you know that your determinism is correct. You believe it because you're inclined to believe it. And in his words, these are altars to unknown gods as much as any commitment to freedom from moral necessity. Okay, so And it's important to notice he's putting them on equal playing field. He's not saying, well, you determinists just have an article of faith that you believe, so therefore you're wrong. He's saying, no, you're right. That's what, the libertarians who think they can prove there's such a thing as freedom, they really just have an article of faith. They want to believe the world is free. That's why they believe it. They don't have evidence. There's no solid argument that can be made because you can't ever discover anything about the actual potentiality, right? Take it from the other side. If a libertarian was saying, no, B was really possible, well, it never happened. How can you measure that it was possible? Do you have a time machine and a reset machine that you can run it again and see that B happens 50% of the time and A 50% of the time? You don't have that. You can't ever investigate what the nature of what could have happened but didn't. So you can't really know if there's freedom or if there's a break or liberty from a deterministic overarching causality. And then he says, but that's exactly the same with the determinists. They also are on equal playing field. These are articles of faith for both of them. They think they've got better arguments, but they don't. I mean, I think that when we read Paul, when we read Paul Ray, I think William James is right. Everything he said was asserting. The determinism cannot be broken, but he never even tried to prove it. He just said, well, of course, that's the only way to think about things that makes sense to me. And William James says, yes, that's the only way to think about things that makes sense to you. It's psychological. It's a truth about you that you can't imagine the world in a different way. But there are other people in the other camp that just keep popping up who find your conception of the world completely impossible to think, and they can't let go of theirs. And that's still just psychological. So the first thing he does here is he puts them all on equal playing field and says, okay, well, now what happens? Do we just pick? Do we just say, well, I want to believe this, so I will? Or do we say the whole question is stupid because there's no point in thinking about it since we can't ever know? Or do we say, well, it's relativistic. It feels this way to you. It feels this way to me. We're all living in our own movies and we're just making up whatever we want to get through the day, and that's fine. William James doesn't do any of that. William James says, now that they're on equal playing field, let's start. Let's start examining. Let's see what we can do to figure out which one we want to ascribe to. So that's the beginning point for him. It's not what he's trying to get to. All right. Furthermore, the compatibilists. Now, here's an interesting thing. So before he's really setting the table, he's really putting all the chess pieces exactly where he wants them. The next thing he says in this first part is he says, I've been talking to you determinists because I respect you. I'm paraphrasing here. You know who I don't respect? All the middle ground people. They can go take a hike. So the hard determinists and the hard libertarians and William James, they're all able to have a good battle and a good conversation with each other. But the one thing they all agree about is that the compatibilists, who we haven't looked at yet, they can all just go jump off a cliff. And remember, the compatibilists are the ones who say, wait, the world is completely determined, or it could be. And at the same time, there could be such a thing as meaningful notions of freedom and moral responsibility, right? We're going to look at those guys because they're pretty clever and they're really fun. But William James makes a really strong argument here. Again, it's too bad we're not reading him after we read them. I'll just tell you right now, in my estimation, William James is doing a really good job of saying to the compatibilists, you guys are playing with words. Ultimately, the reality is that there's no such thing as freedom unless there's actual possibility, and there can't be actual possibility if the world is determined. And so, we're going to look at some compatibilists. They're more impressive than you might imagine they are, but William James takes a moment to say, all right, those guys are off the chessboard. Let's just have the real conversation here from his perspective. Okay. The causationists, the statisticians, the hard determinists, those who believe in fatality, necessity, or even predetermination, as well as the free will determinists. All these have confused the meanings of chance and of freedom, so much so that I will not even talk about freedom, but instead Let us talk about determinism. So that's how he ends that first section. Let's pause, because before we get into his actual arguments, he set the table and everything. We just went over an awful lot. So to recap, William James is one of the founders of Pragmatism, which is an American invented school of philosophy, which basically says, it's not that I care about what works instead of what's true. It's that I define what's true as that which works. Okay. And we had this quote here: consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the object of our conception to have. So you think about an object, you've got a concept of that object, whatever the practical bearings that might conceivably be connected to that notion of yours. Our concept of those effects is the whole of our concept of the object. We actually don't have a concept of the object beyond what effect it could have in the world. So here's an example. There's a ball in the yard. It's blue. It's inflated. And if you kick it, it bounces. It's in a specific location and a specific time, and it's pushing up against the grass. Okay, somebody says, is there a ball in your yard? I say, yes, I have a concept of a ball. The ball is in my yard. I know the ball is in my yard. There's an object that my concept is pointing at. You say, okay, what do you mean there's a ball in the yard? I mean, according to pragmatism, there's something in my yard which, if you kick it, will bounce and make a noise. There's something in my yard which is pushing against the grass. There's something in my yard which reflects light. Okay? The pragmatic effects on the world are the whole of the object. There is no essence of ball that's there, that's doing all those things. The doings that are being done is the only thing that's there. We talked about this in our other course a little bit. It's very much a Nietzschean concept. It's a phenomenological idea as well, sort of. All right, so Socrates famously talked about finding the thing in itself. And Nietzsche does this fun experiment about the thing in itself, which is not a stupid idea, by the way. But let's say, okay, I want to prove to you that there's a table. There's a table sitting next to me. It's got a glass of water on it over here. And so you ask me, is there a table in my room? And I say, yes, there's a table in my room. You say, prove it. And I say, well, what do you mean? You say, well, I want to talk about the table itself. I want to know really the essence of the table. Let's talk about the table till we get to the core of tableness, and we're looking right at the table itself. I say, sure, that sounds fun. And you say, well, prove to me there's a table there at all. And I say, well, there's a lateral surface in my room. It's suspended on legs in a state of, it holds objects in a state of higher gravitational potential energy. If I walk in that area, it has a length, breadth, and width. It's impenetrable, so I'll stub my toe if I'm not paying attention to it. Light hits it and reflects off of it. You see, I can prove there's a table in my room because light of a certain color is bouncing off of it, and that color hits my eye, and so I see it. I can knock on it. My hand doesn't go through it because it's impenetrable, and it's holding up these objects. So yeah, they're there. I've done it. I could measure the room and say, here's where it's located, I suppose. And you say, okay, I thought we were going to talk about the table. And I say, what? You say, I asked you to prove to me there's a table so we can talk about the table. I say, well, I just did prove it to you. I talked to you about, you see, there's a surface. Look, I can show you. You go, no, you agreed that we would talk about the table, not the things the table is doing. Right. My bad, I say to you. Oh, I'm sorry. I got distracted by the things the table was doing. You're right. We want to find the table. So how about this, I say? I suggest, why don't we strip away all the things the table is doing, and whatever's left there, that's the table. And you say, yeah, that's what I want to talk about, the table. That sounds good. Why don't you, since you're talking about something other than the table, you're talking about what the table is doing, why don't you just take away, talk about those things one at a time, and whatever's left will be the table. And I say, okay, great. So I imagine the same table, but light passes through it now. It doesn't reflect and refract light. Light just goes right through it. Still holding my drink up. but it's an invisible table. I now have an invisible table because I took away the thing it was doing when it was reflecting all that light. Okay, well, what if I could walk in that area of the room and not stub my toe because it's not impenetrable? I can pass right through it. I now have a ghost table. I have a ghost table. What if my ghost table stops holding objects up when I put them down so they fall right through? What? There's no table left. There's nothing left that is the table doing those things. The only access we have to a table is the sum total of what the table is doing. Okay, that's a phenomenological idea. What William James is saying is, yeah, that the concepts, instead of saying, oh no, I live in a world without tables, everything is just acting and pretending and impression making. Oh no, that's not the thing I thought was there. I thought there was a thing in itself that did all those things. Instead of doing that, the phenomenologists, they just embrace it. And they say, that's what we mean by table. That's what we're talking about. In fact, what it means to be in the world is to make yourself felt. Not to be something that can make yourself felt. All you are is the impression you make upon other material things and other brains. The table is real. It makes impressions on my brain. It's doing things to other objects. That's what makes it real, but it's not real in any more of a way than that. Okay? So this pragmatic maxim of the William Jamesian school of thought, it applied to material objects, is to say, that's all we mean, is that, you might think your conception is the essence of the table itself, or the Platonic form of the table that is actualizing to whatever potential it has to manifest tableness in this way or something like that. The pragmatic attitude is, no, the table is the things the table is doing and nothing besides. A proton exists because it makes itself felt. Same with a galaxy, same with a star, same with a person, same with a flea. You are real to the degree that you're making impressions on other parts of the cosmos, and the sum total of impressions that you're making on rivers and mines, right? You throw a rock in a lake and it makes ripples. That's you having an effect on the world. You speak and it makes ripples in a person's brain. That's you having an effect in the world. The sum total of effects that you're having in the world is the sum total of what you actually are. And if we strip those things away, there would be nothing there, no essence of you that was doing all those things. We use the word you to refer to the knot we tie around all the doings. Now, we're not arguing that that's correct or incorrect. We're pointing out that that's his starting point. That's the William James attitude. Okay, and so it opens up the possibility of saying, well, what are the effects of the concept, right? The concept that I have of the thing, let's say of the cosmos, of the world. My idea of the universe is a determined thing that's stuck in a chain of unbroken chain of determinism, an overarching principle of causality, as Paul Ray says. If that's my concept of it, what effects does that notion have? And that's what I mean by cosmos, and that's what we're going to measure. If you can give me a different concept of the cosmos that doesn't have those effects or has different effects, I'm saying whatever idea you have of the cosmos, your idea is the practical effects of that concept. Okay, that's probably, so we've had a meta conversation about phenomenology. We've had the direct one there. How about we stop and just open it up for conversation, because there's an awful lot going on here. But essentially, we understand his starting point. And also he says, look, I can judge ideas by the effects that they have, because that's all the ideas really are. And if I find that an idea outrages my moral sense or a moral demand of mine, I am just as entitled to disregard it, or at least to doubt it, as I am if it violates my notions of sequence. 3 is greater than 2 or something like that. So he asserts, he doesn't make a case that he has a right to do that, but he asserts that he has a right to do it. And he also asserts that the only reason we have conversations to come to truth is that the truth we come to is the truth that satisfies us subjectively. and he puts everybody on an equal playing field there. And so he's bringing up psychology, he's bringing up pragmatism and practicality, not to replace philosophical arguments, but because he can't do philosophical arguments without also acknowledging that stuff all the way. So when we get to the later sections and we read his arguments, we're going to judge them on how strong they are in examining philosophically and making philosophical arguments. So we don't want to make the mistake of thinking he's a relativist or a subjectivist in the sense of, well, whatever makes you feel good, just believe that. He's really not that. He says, in fact, what he's saying is, you already believe whatever makes you feel good. That's what he's really saying. He's not saying, oh, believe whatever makes you feel good because the truth don't matter. He's saying you will believe whatever satisfies your demand for truth on a subjective level. That's what you're going to settle with, and you can't get out of that. So let's go examine these ideas and see what they say about us, and whether or not, if we examine the ideas far enough, we'll find a reason to reject one or to follow another one because we find it more satisfying. I'm going to shut up now. Maybe you think that that's a contradiction. Maybe he really is a relativist, or maybe something I'm saying isn't clear. Why don't I just shut up and let's discuss that before we move on with his actual arguments here. Does anybody want to go around the room and just say what did you think about William James? You guys read the whole thing, I think, and we've just barely started talking about the first sixth of it. Does anybody want to pipe in with God, I hate this guy, he sounds like a lunatic, or holy cow, this guy's amazing, or anything else?
Yeah, I was actually going to say that I hated him. No, I guess I have mixed thoughts. It seems like kind of similar to how you said, you're either going to love him or you're going to hate him. And but for me, I think it's mixed in that on one hand, I think that I am in his school of thought, and so, I guess I would like him. On the other hand, while I'm in his school of thought, I think that, in my opinion, because I think it could also be, I'm at fault here. Maybe I was rushed reading it, but I just felt like he was a poor expositor. Like he didn't convey his thoughts well, in my opinion. And I was also trying to rack my brain to find out what the hell support means. I saw here.
Yeah. So I think I figured that out, actually. I meant to go back on it. I think that there were some typos in this, and the space, the first S should have just been the plural of the word before it, I believe. I meant to examine that and come up with the answer, and I forgot to. Here. Support. What the heck is that? So, all right, go ahead with what you're saying, and I'll try to find that word here, and we'll see if we can straighten that out.
No, that was kind of the summary of it. Like, there were different. If I could concretely sort of get at what my point is that, like, right off the top, I don't see why he feels the need to use the word chance so much when he was already doing well with the word indeterminism. Like,
agreed.
Yeah, so I just felt like he took all these extra steps, like talking about the positively and the negatively, and I'm trying to think of, like, in which way is he referring to positive and negative, like, obviously, thinking in the sense of negate, as a negation, and in that sense, I think indeterminism is a better word. And I don't know.
I agree with that.
Yeah, and my other objection was, although so I'm basing this off of your interpretation. I don't know that I guess I did kind of grasp this from reading it myself, but I guess I don't really understand, based on his own logic, why he would object to compatibilists if that's what makes people subjectively satisfied. So
Okay, good. Both of those are great points. Let's talk about the first one. So I think what happened was he obviously took a lot of care and a lot of thought into picking the words he picked. And I agree with you. He should have just said a break in the chain or indeterminism rather than keep bringing up this weirdly defined notion of chance because it got confusing. I think if you read the paragraphs, the context is clearly that he's using the word chance only to the degree. He even defines it in one paragraph as meaning nothing more than that there's a break in the chain. So he should just said indeterminism. But he gave this as a speech. I actually, when I read it, I got the impression that it was probably a pretty inspiring speech. I can imagine, I think it was a speech at Oxford or something. I can imagine people leaving the hall and kind of floating as they walked home a little bit. Not whether they agreed or disagreed. It was an elevating kind of a conversation to be a part of. And then I think people wrote it down or whatever and turned it into this. But, oh, shoot. Oh, good. I didn't ruin anything. Okay, good. All right. So I agree with you about there's a little bit of confusion there, but he's also dealing with some ridiculously sophisticated notions that are really untying knots that are basic assumptions in the way we're all thinking. So the determinists, the hard determinists, and the libertarians, the hardcore libertarians who think I've got a solid argument for all of this, he kind of has to undo. And you see how long it's taking us just to get through the first part in discussing what he did in this essay, is that he's really got to undo a whole lot of the assumptions we have about ourselves and our ability to have a sort of a total truth that it's just he's got a lot to accomplish in a short amount of time. And I think that that's part of it. The second thing you brought up, though, is why doesn't he like the compatibilists so much? And I think the answer to that, that's a good question. I think the answer to that is that he actually has much more respect for the hard determinists and the hardcore libertarians, not because he thinks they have the correct notion that they have that absolute level of understanding of the question, which he doesn't think he's going to prove in a second. Well, we already talked about his argument for it. Can't be resolved like that. But because he thinks they see clearly the problem, right? The compatibilists, he thinks, are trying to pretend like there isn't a problem here, which is what they're doing. Some of them are trying to pretend it. Some of them are arguing that it's just a pseudo problem based on language. And some of them, who are very sophisticated, are doing a really good constructivist approach where they're making positive arguments for how you can understand that these two can be reconciled. But in any case, he doesn't think they can be reconciled. He thinks if the future has to be what it has to be, your choices are nothing more than exactly how Paul described them. They're a link in a chain, and they're caused by the link before, and they cause what comes after them, and that's fine, but they're not free. In order to be free, there has to be the possibility of chance, as he would say, but really just the possibility that there could be breaks in the chain of determinism. And so since he's limiting it to just that, he thinks, we can't deal with the compatibilists. And the important point to remember is that he's not a relativist. He's not saying believe whatever makes you feel good, right? He can make a solid, positive philosophical argument for no to compatibilism. It has to be determinism or free will. He's not saying believe whatever you want. He's not a relativist. Okay? He really isn't. And it's hard for us to understand that because we live with all this postmodern relativism. And we think, well, anybody who's considering psychological motivations and, the level of truth that I accept is that which satisfies me subjectively. It sounds like a person who's just saying, I believe what I want to believe and you believe what you want to believe. And when we get to the end of the essay, it's going to sound a lot like that because after he does all this other arguing to say, no, it's either this or this, these are the consequences of this. These are the consequences of this. A person might be psychologically inclined to accept these consequences more than they accept these consequences. After he does all of that, he says, but a person might be inclined to think the opposite of what I think. So you believe what you believe, embody it, make you go through the world a certain way. And if you thrive and do well, then that's sort of the experiment running, that there might be some truth to your map because it works. I, for one, feel inclined to think that these consequences are less repulsive than these. And so I will do the same thing. I'll try to be as honest as I can about why I accept it. So again, it sounds very relativistic, but he has demands, right? I accept it, but I don't get to just believe whatever I want, right? So here's a good example. I accept that it's better to jump off a cliff and stop living. Well, go jump off a cliff and stop living is what the pragmatist would say. When you do that, you will prove to us that that's not a very good way of mapping out being if you want to get anywhere, right? The pragmatic approach doesn't have no way of judging the ideas, right? It's saying, well, let's imagine 5 people who all want to go from point A to point B, and each one of the 5 has a different conception of the path and the journey and the potential obstacles that might stop them from getting there, or the potential tools that might help them to get there. Whoever uses their ideas and gets there first, fastest, best, or gets there at all when the other 4 fail is closer to the truth. Remember, he's not a relativist. He's not saying there's no such thing as truth. He's saying I'm defining truth as the ideas that help you navigate the world more successfully. Does that make sense? We might agree with it or disagree with it. I just mean, it's clear that he's not being a radical relativist or something when he does this.
Yeah, so it's like their standards, like the difference between being a relativist and his position, if I'm correct, it's like there's standards, whereas in relativism there isn't any. It's just whatever, like anything goes.
If he was a relativist, he would have to say what you say, which is, hey, if you feel like being a compatibilist, just be a compatibilist, right? That's actually a good proof that he's not a relativist, right? He's not being a relative. So one of the things we do, especially with a guy like William James, because what he's doing is very sophisticated. Again, I don't agree. His views in this essay are not mine, right? So I'm not saying he's sophisticated because I'm saying accept him and he's right. Obviously, that would be an absurd thing to say anyway. But what I'm saying is, first of all, he gets some things very right in my estimation. But in any case, what I'm saying is he's proving that he's not a relativist because he's saying there are standards. There are moral standards. There are logical standards. There are philosophical standards. In fact, when he's judging the consequences of determinism, which he does in a surprising and very specific way, right? He doesn't say, oh, if I was a determinist, I wouldn't like living in that world and I'd become depressed. So therefore, it's not a practical thing for me to think. It seems like he's saying that almost because at the end he says, I would hate to live in that world. And so I choose this other one since I can't know for sure which it is, but neither can you. But what he does instead is he says, no. Let's see if I really believe this idea. Does it force me to eventually believe also in nihilism? Does it force me also to believe that the world is a regrettable thing that shouldn't exist? He doesn't say for sure it does, by the way, but we're gonna look at those arguments he makes later. But the point is he's taking the notion and the practical effects of that notion, and he's saying, okay, where does that lead logically and philosophically? Can I believe this without also believing that? And then if I have to believe that, does that put me in a place where my character and my moral demands, as he say, have reason to object? And if they do, I have as much right, since it's not something that can be settled, right? It's different than another question, right? So if you had William James in the room and you said, okay, does gravity work this way or that way? We came up with an experiment that would work out this way if it works this way, but it would work out that way if it works that way. William James wouldn't say, well, run the experiment, but whatever I feel like believing afterwards is what I'm going to believe. He wouldn't say that at all, right? He has to first make the case that you can't possibly use science to figure out if determinism or indeterminism is true. And then once you've proven that, right, with a positive philosophical argument, then you have the room to say, well, I'm not going to throw up my hands. I actually can't live without thinking one or the other. So let me look at the consequences of the ideas, and I'm going to use standards like moral demands to say, I reject this idea, or I reject that idea, or I'm more inclined to accept these difficult to accept things than those even harder to accept things. So he has to create the space for that first, because he doesn't just say, well, believe If compatibilism makes you feel good, then go ahead and believe in compatibilism. Before you even get to the seemingly relativistic arguments, he first uses solid positive arguments to say the compatibilists are off the table. They don't count. We know for sure that if the world is determined, none of my choices change anything. And so let them go confuse themselves all they want. They're out of the picture. You're right. So the point you made is a really good one. If he was a relativist, which he's not, he would have to say, well, if compatibilism makes you feel good, why not believe that? That's not what he's saying. He's saying, I know philosophically that compatibilism doesn't work. It's either determinism or indeterminism. And if it's determinism, my choices do not actually change the world in any way, other than that they're already determined and, whatever. There is no actuality of the there's no I shouldn't say actuality of the possible. The possible is actually impossible, right? There is no real possibility to the possible if determinism is true. So the compatibilists are off. Now that we have this, I have to have another positive argument that says, now, wait a minute. The consequences of either of these ideas are never manifest in the world in a way where I could find evidence that either one was true, because they're talking about possibilities that don't happen. And the possibilities that don't happen, if they're impossible, they don't happen. But if they're possible, they don't happen. And because they don't happen, they're never data I can collect. I can't know anything about them, which means I can never settle the question of if they're really possible. Which means the determinists have no right to say for sure the world is deterministic, and the libertarians have no right to say for sure there's actual possibility and potential out there that could be realized through your choices. Neither one can say they know for sure, because it's not about something that you can settle in that way. So now that we've gotten rid of the things we can settle, this one can't be settled in that way. Yet, just like I have scientific notions and logical notions and notions of sequence that I can apply to ideas, and if it outrages them, I would throw the idea out, right? I'm not going to accept an idea that's self-contradictory, right? You can still do philosophy in that realm, even if you can't settle it in that solid sort of a way. He says, just like that, I also have moral demands. There are things that I have a character, and my character's in the world, and that character finds certain things repugnant, and it finds other things praiseworthy and laudable and acceptable. I'm not going to pretend that that's not a part of the universe too. My psychology and my inclinations are a part of it. And so it's not just that the map has to map onto the world, but the map has to be acceptable to me, or else I'm not going to use it. I'm going to throw it away and not use it. And I have every right to do that because I'm also a part of the universe. That's actually a really good way of putting it. I'm glad we talked about it that long, right? Think about that map thing again. What's true about the map is how well it helps you to navigate the world. But earlier he had this quote where he said, oh, well, that's not a quote. Well, it is a quote from him. But the pragmatic maxim is that, oh, no, wait a minute. That's not the one I'm looking for. Hold on. Here it is. Okay. We make theories about the world and discuss them with one another. We do so in order to attain a conception of things which shall give us subjective satisfaction. That's his first point of the two things he uses to set it up. So he says, first of all, the map has to map onto the world. If you can prove it doesn't, if it says there's a forest here and a cliff here, but you know that they're switched, you can reject the map. Right? You can say, I found things that are true in the world that prove that map is garbage. So he's not a relativist. The forest is there. The cliff is over here. Your map has them switched. Fuck your map. But not only does the map have to map onto the world, it can't perfectly map onto the world. It can't be every single proton in the United States is represented in the map without having another United States. That's not a useful map. If I have to unfold the map, right? There's a comedian, Stephen Wright, who once said, I have a map of the United States that's actual sized. Folding it is a bitch, right? It's a pretty funny joke. He's great at the one-liners. But a map that's actual sized is completely unuseful. All the useful maps are cartoonifications. They're simplifications of what's really there. Excuse me. You can reject them if they're in error. If they have an obvious error, you can throw them out. He says the compatibilists have an error. Throw it out. But beyond that, I have to also accept the map. So if two maps are just as good for mapping onto the world, because nothing in the world could determine which one is correct or incorrect, because the thing that they differ in isn't something that you could ever find in, this is his whole argument. You can't find anything physical in the world that would let you know which of these is more correct. Think about it this way. You have two almost identical maps in the sense of where they tell you everything is. But at the top of one of them, the title of the map says, everything is fated and nothing is worthwhile. And at the top of the other one, there's this very beautiful calligraphy that says, go forth and make good choices. And what William James is saying is, wait a minute, there's no difference between these maps that could ever have a practical effect in the world. However, I don't have to accept both of the maps. I could find a reason to not want to look at the world through the lens of reminding myself that my choices matter, my choices matter. Or I could be psychologically predisposed to not want to look at the world through the lens of nothing you do matters, nothing you do matters. Okay? I'm glad we talked this out this long, because this is exactly what he's really saying here. You can reject a map if it doesn't map onto the world in an obvious way. You throw it out. But if there's no distinction between two maps, and yet there's something about you that doesn't want to accept one of them, he says, we make these theories to come to these truths because we want a truth that is subjectively acceptable to us. Now, what we could do is we could take a look at the details of the map, the details of the determinism and the indeterminism way of viewing things, and we can say, wait a minute, what are the logical, philosophical consequences, and can I live with them? And we know where he gets to because we've read it already, but he gets to a point where he says, actually, some people will be inclined to this one, and some will be inclined to this one. For my part, I think the thing we all have to do is be as real and honest about why it is we're inclined in one way or another, and try to live our lives according to that and see how well it works. How about that? I like that map thing. So that's because otherwise it's confusing. It's like, wait a minute, you're saying you accept the map because you accept it. Isn't that relativism? It's like, no, you can totally reject a map if it tells you the cliff is in the place that the highway is. That's not a good map. Throw that map out. You can do that. But if you can prove that there's no difference to what it's depicting about the world, there's no thing that can happen in the world that would tell you, oh, this map is correct and that map is not correct, then you're not done. You can still use other criterion for judging which one of them you want to accept. And those have to come from your willingness to look at the world through that lens and real philosophical examination of what the consequences of that lens are. Man, I'm glad we talked it out that far. That's a really, really good, that's exactly what he's doing, by the way. That's exactly what he's doing with these ideas. All right, does anybody want to say anything, or should we move on to the next part? I didn't realize, but this is clearly going to be a more than one day thing with William James.
I was going to say, if he is saying, look, either map essentially doesn't matter, you're going to pick map A or map B. Maybe I'm missing something here when he's just disregarding the compatibilist, because it's like, well, what would be the difference then of combining the two if you can't prove either one to be true? So
yeah, that's interesting. Why not take both maps?
Right. So if either one doesn't matter, you're going to pick A, you're going to pick B, then why would it matter if you combine them, if you found something useful from both of those maps?
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. You could say, look, this can't be settled. How about I roll up the one map and put it in my left pocket? I'll roll up the other one and put it in my right pocket. And depending on how I feel or which one seems to be like the right one to care about in the specific issue that I'm trying to settle, do I turn to the left or turn to the right? Well, it's this type of question. Why not just allow myself to jump between the two? Uh, right now, we're going to have to speculate because we haven't read anything, I don't think, that hints at that exactly. There might be an integrity principle involved. There might be some sort of idea that you want to be consistent in your character, and so grab onto determinism if that's what you're inclined to believe. And it's fine, that map works just as well. It's going to tell you the truth about what's going to happen just as well as it can, and it's not going to be any worse at it than the other map. So grab onto it completely and live your life with that conviction, or grab onto the other one. But you're right. There's a few other things you could say. You could say, why don't I just tear the top off of both of these maps or either of these maps? Say, I don't give a damn about the question anymore, and because it doesn't have any practical effect. And you're a pragmatist, William James. Maybe you should not care. There's reasons why he does, but maybe you should not care and just say, well, it's a meaningless question. Or what you suggested, why not say, hey, I use either notion when it seems appropriate. And appropriate is a weird word because I already said that I'm only able to use either one because there are no practical effects as far as what actually is predicted about the world. But, I use whichever one fits me, whatever one I feel like, since that's the judgment that you're using. Some days I feel like I'll be stronger if I use the determinism lens, or I'll be more successful if I think about the moral responsibility of my free choices. So I'll just jump back and forth whenever I feel like it, since it's not settlable. I wonder what he would say to that. That's interesting.
Well, if the goal is saying, look, I'm going based on the facts here, then isn't it it'd be constantly evolving of finding what the truth is? So maybe on one of those maps, it's the cliff is located where it says it is, and then using that same map, the forest is in a different place on map A, but on map B, the forest happens to be where it says it is. I mean, it would seem to be to use the exercise and maybe being able to compare, but then he's also saying, look, you're not going to know either way, I suppose. So what would be the point of going back and forth? But I guess isn't that point of the exercise, though, if you're trying to find the truth, is going through the thought experiment of the determinism versus indeterminism.
So it's important to remember that the only reason for saying you could pick either map based on what subjectively satisfies you is because there is no difference in the map. Both maps say the forest is here and the cliff is over here. If they had a practical difference to them, then you could use one map and fall off a cliff and the other map would get you. And he wouldn't say it matters what you feel like you want to accept. He would say use the correct map. The only reason that they're both on equal playing field for what you accept is that the only criterion left is which one you like. So that's why I said it was some sort of painting title at the top. Okay. Right. So he would say the third map is the compatibilist one. That one's retarded. Tear it up. It's self-contradictory. It doesn't make sense. Right. But the fact that they both nothing could possibly happen in the world that would tell you, oh, I'm really in the determinist map. Oh, I'm really in the free will map. The fact that that's not possible because they're identical in any of those practical ways is the only reason why he's given himself the space to say, so therefore you have to think one of them. What does it say about your character? Let's examine the ideas and see if you decide I'd rather believe this than believe that, since they're both on equal playing field. But this idea of yours is kind of, so one of the things that's so powerful about your idea of saying, I'm going to roll up both maps and carry them both with me, because some days I'm going to feel more one than the other, is that that's what everybody does, right? Determinists, hard determinists, they forget that they're hard determinists often during the day. And libertarians, as Paul Ray pointed out, people who believe in freedom and I can make the future be what I want it to be, they don't think that way when they go to the doctor. If the doctor says, well, your disease has no cause, it's just manifesting itself, they don't say, oh, I understand, because the world does have breaks in determinism. And so that could be the case. They say, I'm going to wring your neck. What the hell are you talking about? You might not know the cause, but it has to be cause, right? So what's really funny and interesting about your suggestion is everybody follows it, even if they think that they're hard determinists or hardcore libertarians. And I think I have a suspicion of what Paul would say to, or what William James would say to that. However, what we might say to him first to challenge him on it is to say something like, isn't it more practical, because we've got to go according to what he thinks matters, right? Isn't it more practical to have both available to you since you don't know which one is correct? And I think his inclination, at least, that maybe if we read between the lines, is something like live an internally consistent, integral life, and be a hardcore determinist and care about science and live that life. You might live you're going to probably live a better life if you're integral and consistent as much as you can be. That might be his assumption. I'm not sure. We're sort of putting words in his mouth here. But that's a cool idea. And it's not clear that he's addressed that objection. I don't think he has addressed that idea at all. He's anticipated lots of things and responded to them, but I don't think he anticipated someone saying, well, everybody has both maps and the title fits with their subjective acceptability notions one day versus the other day. And so let's just use them both whenever we feel. That's such a good question, because I feel like it would. What's great about it as a challenge to William James is that if you threw that pitch at him, he'd have to deal with it, because he hasn't said, oh, that's out of bounds already. That's totally following his entire formulation of the question and the problems. And it's really something I don't think, well, maybe we can pay attention and read it again. Maybe he's hinted at something like that, but I don't think so. I don't think he thought of that at all in this essay, at least. Okay, that's really fun. This is a hell of a guy to work through. This is really some fun stuff. Do we want to move on to part two? I didn't think it would take us this long to get through part one, where he's just setting the table for what he's going to say about determinism and free will. And it's been an hour. I don't mind staying here for 10 freaking hours. It's a great conversation. But what do you guys, how about you take a vote? Do you want to do the next part?
I think it's all right to go either way with it. I have a question for you guys. So
Shoot.
William James, you wrote, well, I guess Zara has a book, actually. He wrote a book about psychology. It took him 12 years to write. He didn't like it when it was done. He criticized it for being, well, he insulted his own book there pretty darn well, and said it was way too long and too wordy. And I feel like I would say some of the same thing about the way he words things. It's just, there's a lot of 50-cent words that it just seems excessive at times. But it could be a personal. It's subjective, I'm sure. But I thought that he argued. Well, first of all, I thought Paul Ray didn't do a very good job. It was just an assumption, pretty much, and he tried to justify an assumption. And William James here is rightly pointing out that neither side, free will or determinist, or can be proven. And I just think all this, I find him to be kind of an interesting character. But I guess I'm certainly more aligned. I think that I'm more aligned with the rationalists than anything. And I think he did a pretty good job, but he's a little bit too long-winded, and it's kind of confusing at times the way he writes. And it could be just the fact that it's 150 years since that kind of language has been really common or whatever. But then again, so then my question is, how much do you think his passion for psychology affects
Good question.
I guess.
Good question. So first of all, you did a bit of a deep dive into the life of William James, and
Shallow,
please
shallow,
feel
yeah.
free to talk more about that in a minute. We'll open it up to that because you looked into his history and his life a bit, which is pretty cool. I think that you asked the question a while back, Path, where is Nietzsche in all of this? One of the answers is he's here. He's William James, who disagrees with Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a fatalist. He's disagreeing with him specifically in this essay. But William James is made possible because of Nietzsche, without a doubt. William James is one of the children of Nietzsche. In our Consummate Thinkers course, we look at these thinkers who basically everybody who comes after them is trying to grapple with what they did in one way or another. And that's clearly the relationship between William James and Nietzsche here. So the psychology thing, so how did you word the question? Why such relevance to psychology in a philosophical debate?
Well, Bill, he originally wanted to be a doctor, and he got drawn in by psychology and philosophy. And I think we've already discussed, and you brought it up. I think that it's interesting to look at people's with these philosophers' personalities or motives or what might. I mean, having a hard time finding words right now, but
you're doing fine.
Keep your to get shaped by their lives and everything. So, anyways, he spent like 12 years writing a book that he promised he'd have done in 2 years, and then he wished he could cut it in half. He was done, which I think is interesting. And apparently, people online call it the Einstein of psychology. It's a pretty well-regarded book. So I'm wondering how that might tie into. Well, I think he's very rational, I guess is what I'm saying. He's a very rational man. Like he in his book, he like
that's what I was wondering.
Trying to study. He hypnotized. I think he was hypnotized. I'm not sure, but he had the section on hypnosis. He did like parapsychology, like psychics. Just trying to research and categorize. I think he did an experiment where he just like spun people around in chairs on like a 360 axis, so kind of like a gyroscope. What it sounded like anyway. Pretty interesting.
Yeah. So the people who try to wrestle with Nietzsche and what he accomplished, one half of them, the one camp of the two camps, is definitely a fun group of people. Now, Freud criticized Jung. He said something, I won't get the quote exactly right, something like, I used to really like Jung before being a psychologist wasn't good enough and he wanted to be a prophet, something like that. And there's definitely one of the two camps of those who come after Nietzsche who are wrestling with what it is that he exposed or just let's just say what he said is a camp of people who are very, very attracted to speculative reasoning. Like, let's go way the hell out to stuff where we don't have solid definitions and we can't even use our eyes to see what we're talking about. And let's feel our way in this really, really out there realm. And of course, 99.99999% of people who have an inclination to do something like that are probably going to fry their brains and babble nonsense and have very little that they can bring back to us. But Jung somehow managed. Somehow he had enough of a safety harness and was able to go way the hell out there and bring back some really wild comprehensibility to things that are just way out there. And I think William James is inclined in the same way. And you can see that that he has that sort of a courage to examine and go places with an understanding of the necessary elements that are being brought to it by us without being terrified of that, but embracing it and feel around in places where, most philosophers say, I want a solid argument. And he says, well, a solid argument isn't possible, but let's go feel our way around and see what the consequences are anyway. So let's talk about why it would be, really quickly, this would be useful, why it would be that Nietzsche would make it possible for people to be so out there as one of the two ways of trying to comprehend what he was up to anyway. And I think the answer is Well, it's in the title of our Consummate Thinkers course, which is the second year philosophy stuff, where we look at this all chronologically and we tell a narrative story about each of the philosophical contributors. I mean, we did the truncated version where we just looked at the big six. But if you look at the conversation between each of the big six and how these camps diverge away from each other in trying to comprehend what the last consummate thinker did, so one of the things to think about these consummate thinkers is that they synthesize the mythopoetic, narrative, characterological understanding of the world with the objective, propositional or scientific or argumentative, solid, typical philosophical game. They do both at the same time. And Nietzsche, so another thing we could pick up on is William James is allergic to nihilism. His reason for rejecting determinism, even though he doesn't take it to a solid place where it's definitely the case. He leaves it open that the conversation needs to continue. But his reasoning is nihilism seems too closely connected with the consequences of accepting determinism. And we haven't gotten there yet, so it's not fair to prejudge it when we're having this discussion, although I'm sure you've all read it already. But essentially, he said, look, my character, when I said characterological, my character doesn't like that, right? I'm in the world too. I'm a part of what's in the world, and I say yes to being. Why? Because I choose to. If you think about, here's the picture. At the end of the third Matrix, Agent Smith is demolishing Neo, and Neo's being beaten into the ground. And finally, he gets tired of it. And Agent Smith says, why do you persist? You must be able to see it by now. It's all going to come to nothing. That's the nihilism. I am nothingness, and it's all going to come to nothing. And he says, why do you persist? And then Neo looks up at him and he says, because I choose to. And that infuriates the hell out of Agent Smith, who just can't handle the idea that your character might be to say, I wish there was nothing and I want to bring it all to nothing. But you're not actually right. You don't know that you're right. There's another character in the world that says yes to being, that says, I just happen to be in the world, and I don't say it would be better if nothing was than that there be something. That's what you say. That's fine. We're fighting. But you have me to fight with because the universe itself can produce characters who say yes to the cosmos and yes to being. Now, this isn't the stuff he's talking about, but all of that's in there. All of those seeds, and we don't have time to go into all of Nietzsche to fully flesh it out, but all the seeds of that conversation are completely here within this essay of why it is that he says, okay, there's room for my character to play a role in how we think about this. And my character is allergic to nihilism. And then he says, here's why I see nihilism too closely connected to, remember, he says, it's either a sickly romanticism, which is actually more of Nietzsche's perspective, by the way. It would be what William James would call a sickly romanticism. So it's not clear that you'd have to accept nihilism. But the other side is that you'd have to accept a kind of nihilism. And that's of the seesaw reasons to reject determinism. He says, either I have to accept that the world is a regrettable thing because regrettable things happen and each thing that happens is tied into the rest of everything, or I have to accept that if I could have the perspective of the whole, I would say yes to it anyway, even though it's all determined, which is much closer to Nietzsche's perspective. I think that is, I mean, we should flesh it out more, but without insulting Nietzsche, that cartoon thing I just said is basically his perspective. And William James rejects both of those, but he's rejecting the one side specifically for characterological reasons, that his character has a moral demand that says yes to being and doesn't want to accept the nihilism that he sees as one of the two alternative ways of accepting determinism. He then also rejects Nietzsche's fatalism, which is also a life-affirming attitude. And so he has a totally, so I'm not saying he's a carbon copy of Nietzsche, but I'm saying that he's wrestling in the way that Nietzsche's Zarathustra modeled that you can wrestle with these questions. And so when we say characterological, that's really what we're talking about, is that your character has something to say about what it's possible for the cosmos to manifest. And the cosmos has created personal creatures with personalities, some of which feel averse to certain things and some feel averse to the opposite things, and that tells you something about the world, which is all, according to William James, acceptable things to examine and consider when doing philosophy. That's we're going to have to stop. I mean, we can keep talking about this, but there's no way we're going to go any further because I've already done a really rapid version of talking about those things, and none of that is a fair treatment of those notions. So we should probably just stop here and talk this part of it out to death. There was something else you said that was interesting. There's a lot you said that was interesting. There's something else you said. Forgive me, I don't remember exactly. I'll remember in a second. Oh, I had a question. Path, you said you side with these rationalists. Are you calling William James a rationalist? It sounded like that's what you were saying.
No, I meant pragmatist, I think.
Oh, pragmatist. You meant to say pragmatist. Okay.
That's cool.
I understand. Because when you first said you side with the rash, I thought you
So
meant
far, I don't think he makes a perfect argument, but I think he's right. It's not something that really can be, argued out. It's just whichever. I mean, let's see. One thing I did. Now that I'm talking, I'm just going to ramp for a second. I was reading something. Something there. He mentioned something that reminded me of that song, that Rush song, "Free Will." So I think that Neil Peart had read William James, or possibly something about free will. You literally have the choice to believe it or not believe it. Right? Something along those lines, which is one of the lines in the song. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. The name of the song's "Free Will." Yeah. So that obviously made me think. One made me think of the other correlation, and then yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. So this brings up a really fun thing to talk about. We're just getting into philosophy 101 here. So let's just talk about philosophy in general. So it's like, all right, well, this guy writes a song and it seems like he must have read William James in order to write the song. One of the really fun things about philosophy, I think, is that all of the ideas you've ever heard or talked about, they kind of came from philosophers, and you don't know where they come from, but they're the only ideas maybe that you have access to. That's a bit of an exaggeration. You have a lot of mythopoetic and religious notions and dream ideas and stuff too. But as far as propositional words, I remember when I was really young, reading Mill and being like, wait a minute, I've used the phrase "the lesser of two evils" my whole life. Everybody talks like this, but it was a guy, it was Mill, who came up with that formulation. And so it's one of the fun things about doing the kind of course we're doing now, which is academic formal philosophy, is that we're going to be introduced to the inventors of the formulations of notions that basically dominate, even if everybody around us is cliche thinking all the time, the words they have access to that they feel subconsciously should mean something are still words that came from these people that are doing this thinking. And so it's kind of like a get to the bottom of the code that's running the code that's running the code, right? The code we're working on in our public conversations is maybe based on a few layers of code. It's kind of like getting to the assembly language a little bit, as far as, if philosophers are changing what's available in that language for us to, distort and misunderstand and misuse or ascribe to in a cliche manner or whatever. It might be apps up here, but getting back to those lower levels is it's really a powerful thing to do, and it comes with a lot of benefits in life. So that's a fun thing to talk about. That's a side note about just why it's fun to do this kind of a course and what you can get out of it. How about this? Why don't we I feel like I don't want to stop without at least looking at the argument that we've been hinting at him making for a while here. So let me just look here. Yeah, okay. So we already talked about section 2. Let's read through the notes on this already really quickly and just nail it down. It's basically his argument for why there's no difference practically in the maps, except that they've got a different title on them, basically, right? How he has to establish that. He can't just claim it. He has to make a positive philosophical argument for the idea that you can't settle scientifically if we're in a deterministic world or an indeterministic world. So quickly, he says, looking into the facts around us to find an argument for determinism or against indeterminism, or for indeterminism against determinism, is impossible because determinism claims the totality of the facts of the state of the universe at any time determine what the future states of the universe will be. Of course, good definition. Indeterminism claims there are multiple real possibilities for the future, and the only thing that precludes the one is the fact that the other manifests. But it is not determined to do so and could have gone the other way. It's a real possibility. This is because there's some ambiguity in the parts that make up the whole universe, that it's not completely determined. Those are the two positions. Fine. Excuse me. Only one of those could be true. It can't be that they're both true. So he's sort of hinting at you can't use both maps, but not really, because he's going to say you can't settle it, so might as well bring both maps. But he's admitting that logically, from this lens of looking at determinism and indeterminism, they can't both be true. They're direct contradictions of each other. And then he says determinism says possibilities are really impossibilities. They're just illusions, unless they be the one necessary future. So of all the things you think can happen, only one of them can happen. Only one of them, that same one, has to happen. All the others really are impossible. You just don't know all the factors that go into why this will be the one that has to happen, and these are the ones that can't happen. All right, we said that before. Let's move on. So there's actual possibilities which exist in a real sense, even though there are only a minority. All right, so determinism says possibilities are actual impossibilities. They're illusions. Indeterminism says there are actual possibilities which exist in a real sense, even if only the minority of them ever become actualized. This applies to volitions. Okay, so the next thing he does is he's going to limit all of that chain versus breaking of the chain only to human choices. So he's not going to talk about, this is why I shouldn't have used the word chance so much. He's not going to talk about chaos and randomness and accidents and capriciousness. Maybe there's a capricious God who rolls dice and random things happen, but the dice aren't determined to land the way they do. He's not going to bring, he says, look, all I'm saying is, let's consider breaks in the chain that are just the cause of agents making choices. Maybe those other things are real, maybe they're not, but he's going to limit his examination to just that and say that would still require indeterminism. And then he says, determinists say a man wanted something at such and such a time. The indeterminist said he did, and we are pleased that you admit so. But he also could have wanted something else at that same time. The determinist replies, that second point of yours is nonsense, because only what happens could have happened. Now we get to the crux of why external investigation cannot resolve this question between the two perspectives. Science claims that it says nothing except that which is based on demonstrable facts, things that have happened. How could any investigation into what happened give us insight into the nature, real or otherwise, of something which didn't happen? How can science settle the question of our possibilities, which do not come to be really possible at all, which do not come to be, are really possible at all? How could it settle that question one way or another? If the only things it can consider are the things that actually happen. And here's the quote. What divides us into possibility men versus anti-possibility men, and this is a much better distinction than his chance versus determinism thing. Possibility, yes, possibility is real. Anti-possibility, it's all just illusion. It's all impossible except the actual that is necessary, right? Possibility men versus anti-possibility men. What distinguishes us are different faiths or postulates. Postulates of rationality. To this man, the world seems more reasonable, acceptable. He says rational with possibilities in it. To that man, the world seems more rational. It means reasonable or acceptable with possibilities excluded. And talk as we will about having to yield to evidence, what makes us monists or pluralists determinists or indeterminists is at bottom always some sort of sentiment like this. So again, he's not saying that's true of every question. He's saying it's true of this question. I've made the point. He's trying to make the point. Maybe he's wrong and people could argue with it, but he's trying to make the argument that there is no scientific reason for anybody to be anti-possibility or pro-possibility. What there is instead is two different camps of people with two opposite psychological inclinations. One who says a world where anything can happen seems horrifying and gross and terrifying to me, versus others who say a world where nothing can happen except it all has to happen because we're all monkey robots chained. It seems like a horrifying world and I don't want to believe in it. He says both of you believe what you believe because you are turned off by the other idea. It's subjective acceptance of the map that says one thing versus the map that says the other at the top. But both maps don't say anything that you could scientifically determine which one is correct to be titled that way. It's just preference. But it is, he does seem to think from earlier that it is a claim to truth. Right? So some people might say, well, wait a minute, if it has no practical effect, especially if you're a pragmatist, why are you saying it could have any truth value at all? Right? It seems like a real pragmatist would say, because it has no consequences, it's not even true. There's something confused about the question. Determinism is a confused babbling, and indeterminism is confused babbling. However, William James seems to think, no, both of these things, one of these could be true, making the other one false. But it can't be true in a way that impacts what happens in the world where we can measure which one is true. So therefore, it has to be true to our moral demands or acceptable to us or something like that. We'll have to, there might be a weakness there in his position. We'll have to explore that more later. Okay. Man, it's going to take us forever to get through this. In all of the first three sections, he's really still setting the stage. I wanted to get to the point where we would look at his actual arguments about determinism and why he says these are the consequences and why I reject it. Why don't we do this? Let's quickly get through the third section where he's still setting the damn table to get ready for that. And that's just his talk about chance, where he defines it a certain very strange way. So the idea of chance, summation, real possibilities are the same as chance. It's the same as chaos. Unreason and insanity in the mind and the personality of the determinist. All right. Well, I think what I meant to say is that real possibilities, things that the realness of possibilities is like chance. It's like chaos. It's completely unacceptable to the determinist psychologically. There's another way to think about chance, however. Okay, that's fine. So he says, let's think about chance instead, not as something positive, like it's the source of randomness that comes into the world. It's not potentiality making crazy things happen you couldn't predict. Instead, it's purely negative, and it's a negation of the determinist principle. It means disconnected from necessity. So he wants to use the word chance only as not everything is determined. Well, okay, fine. We have to keep in mind that that's how he's using it. Because otherwise we'll think he made a worse argument than he made, perhaps. However, it does have a positive connotation in that it, in this view, must be a thing itself with its own reality. The whole universe must wait for what chance will offer up to it, right? So in other words, his conception is not that there's a chain that would be set, but it gets broken by an agent. It's more like there's a chain leading up to the question of what the agent will do. And then the agent comes in and gives the universe what it needs to start going down one of the two chains, depending on what the person chose. Some of you are probably thinking about some attempts to conceptualize particle physics and quantum theory, because sometimes they talk about it that way as a split of possibilities. Anyway, I'm not saying that's an endorsement of it or that we've understood it correctly. I'm just saying that idea probably pops into people's minds when we talk about it that way. Okay, however, it does not have a positive connotation to it. It does have a positive connotation in this, that the universe is. So if my choice is real and it's not determined, then the rest of the universe is waiting for me to make my choice before it can become what it can become. And The same with other choices. My view is not claiming that anything we can imagine as physically possible is equally likely to occur, right? So he has to do a lot of the same things that Paul Ray has to do. He has to make it clear that he's not saying some absurd absolute. So he does that. Just that all the things which can tempt us to choose are really possibilities that we might choose. Okay, he's not making a case for it. He's just saying that's my position. Now let's examine the consequences of that in the next section versus the consequences of determinism. So we shouldn't feel like he made an argument for that. He's just saying, let me make it clear to you how I'm viewing my place in the world. It's the way people tend to view it anyway. I believe that I have choices and I can be tempted to various things, and I make a decision, and that's a thing I'm doing that I'm not forced to do, and that affects the world. That's all he's saying. He's not really saying anything more complicated than that. And also, he's not making a case out of that. He's not saying a lot of stuff depends on you accepting this. He's just saying, let me show you what the top of my map looks like versus the top of the other map. And then in the next section, we'll examine the consequences. So we don't have to accept it. We just have to understand what it is he's saying. And it's pretty straightforwardly an indeterminist perspective that his choices are real. Okay. To this kind of indeterminism, choices are peculiar psychic facts which are independent from the natural flow of the rest of the universe. It is a moment of partial authorship the agent has in the universe. It's a standard libertarian definition of it, but he's going to argue for it in his unique way that says, I can't prove it and neither can you prove the opposite. So let's look at the consequences, which I can't wait to get to. We won't do today, but we'll finish with one more quote here and then we'll stop looking at this. Determinism denies the ambiguity of future volitions because it affirms that nothing future can be ambiguous. Sure, seems right about that. But we have said enough to meet the issue. Indeterminate future volitions do mean chance. It means by chance, he means a break in the deterministic chain. That's all he means. Let us not fear to shout it from the housetops if need be, for we know now that the idea of chance is, as I'm using it at bottom, exactly the same as the idea of a gift. The one simply being a disparaging, the other eulogistic name for anything on which we have no effective claim. That we can't say it's determined. We know it has to happen. That's all. It's new. It's potential. It's coming into being. It's going to be a part of what matters, but it's not ours to own already. When we get there and make the choice, then it comes. Okay. And whether the world be better or worse for having either these potential, he says chances, but these breaks in the causal chain or gifts, chances or gifts in it, will depend altogether on what those uncertain and unclaimable things turn out to be. Okay, so we're going to stop now. There's no way we're going to go through the rest, but just very clearly, he's trying to set up the question in this way. He says, look, some people find it completely revolting to imagine that things can happen in the universe that we couldn't know ahead of time if we knew everything, that they're not determined. We have no claim on them, as he says. But I say there's nothing negative about that, because if the choice is a good one, then good things come into being. And if the choice is bad, then bad things come into being. And so breaks in determinism are not bad qua breaks in determinism. Just because they're breaks in determinism, don't make them bad to me. Now we're done. So they're not bad in and of themselves. They're just to be judged based on what they come into them. So again, all of this table setting for the first three sections is really in every aspect to say we are on equal playing field. You are not more scientific than I am. You are not less fictional than I am. You are not less psychologically inclined to believe what you believe than I am, and that plays less of a determined role or less of a significant ingredient role into why you believe what you believe. He's saying we are exactly on equal playing field. Now, in our next lecture, we'll start looking at his examination of the consequences of believing either of these things, which will give him the case that for why he accepts libertarianism instead of determinism, which again, he refuses the entire time to make a solid argument that says you also have to think the way I think, because then you wouldn't be free. And he thinks we're on equal playing field. So he's not going to say, you can't force me to believe in determinism, and then turn around and say, I can force you to believe in libertarianism. He's going to say, no, we're on equal playing field. No one can force anyone to believe anything. It's not that type of question. And he's going to be admirably consistent in that right to the end. But if he's right about that, he says that's not the end of the conversation. It's not believe whatever you want. It's figure out what the consequences of the belief are, and then make an educated judgment of whether or not you really want to believe it. And he says at the end, some people really want to believe it, and some people really don't. I don't. And so we'll get into that later. So we'll do that next time. We're going to end the broadcast. We'll do our after conversation. Before I end it, because I keep ending it too quickly, and then people say amazingly awesome things, and it's not in the class, I'm going to shut up and say anybody and everybody who wants to have a final say before we end the recording and go to the after show, please take over. You all read this. Do you think I'm missing it? Do you think I'm trying to describe what it is he's saying? Do you think I'm not getting it? Do you think I'm inaccurately describing his position? Because you can argue with that too, obviously. We're not here to argue with my understanding of the text. We're here to argue with the text. So those are, please make those comments as well. If anybody had anything they really liked or really didn't like about this, feel free to share. I know you guys get more talkative when we go to the after show. So if nobody's going to speak up, I'm going to end it. Let's go have an even better conversation, and we'll probably wrap it up. And what we'll do is we'll do the second half, the last 2 or 3 sections of William James next time, which will be Friday evening, and I'll upload the reading. All right, thank you.